At 4:25 a.m. local time, 6 Ukrainian FPV drones lifted off from a hidden launch site near the coast of Odessa, racing straight toward the Kerch Strait area in the Black Sea, where they knew 4 Russian boats were approaching. Intelligence indicated that these boats planned to use the early morning hours to deliver supplies to coastal observation posts. What the Ukrainian operators did not yet realize was that a Russian Italmas Salyut drone had already detected them in advance. The FPV drones skimmed low, flying only about 50 feet above the water before accelerating eastward. Their cameras opened onto the Kerch Strait like a narrow strip of blue-gray water squeezed between low stretches of land and silent sandbars. In the distance, the Kerch Bridge stretched across the horizon, giving the scene a calm yet quietly tense atmosphere. The Russian boats, still hidden behind the bend ahead, had already begun pushing into the narrow choke point that Ukraine intended to ambush. The chase had begun. One side was racing to deliver supplies, the other racing to stop them, and the distance between them was closing fast. But the Russian Italmas was closing the distance even faster. The first warning came from a Ukrainian observer. The main operator looked up from his screen for just a split second long enough to notice a dark speck sliding across the low cloud cover, diving lower and faster by the moment. Within seconds, that speck sharpened into the unmistakable shape of a triangular flying wing. A Russian loitering drone was heading straight for their control position. On the FPV screens, the Ukrainian drones were still nearly 4 miles from the ambush point, but at that moment, it no longer mattered. The real threat was diving directly overhead. He didn't wait for orders. The main antenna cable was yanked free from the transmitter, the backup connector grabbed in the same motion, and both men bolted from the position. His teammate was already sprinting toward a secondary control site about 550 yards away. Above them, the Italmas continued descending, locking onto the thermal signature of the spot where the 2 operators had been sitting just seconds earlier. The final 3 seconds seemed to blur together. Both men dove into a wooden reinforced shelter just as the drone slammed into their former position behind them, throwing up a column of dirt nearly 20 feet high. The Italmas is a flying wing loitering munition developed by Zala, powered by a piston engine and capable of maneuvering through altitude changes and wide turns. Open sources often describe it as having a range of more than 120 miles, a speed of roughly 75 to 95 miles per hour, and a warhead weighing several dozen pounds, meaning that a direct hit on an exposed control site could have been devastating. But under that sky, the one thing the Italmas could not stop were the FPV drones that had already departed. By now, they had pushed more than 1.5 miles forward, skimming past their first reference marker, a collapsed wooden bridge near the water's edge, before continuing to hug the sea surface, racing toward the interception point at steady speed. The Russian boats continued pushing their engines hard through the narrow waterway, leaving white wakes tearing along both sides of the low banks. On the backup control screens, the Ukrainian teams understood the problem clearly. If they couldn't regain full control quickly enough, they might lose the link before the FPV group reached the interception point. That was when the relay network came into play. When the main control station was knocked out, the connection didn't collapse with it. Instead, it automatically switched to a backup route exactly the way the system had been designed from the beginning. In the war in Ukraine, both sides have increasingly relied on distributed sensor networks and relay nodes to keep drones operating even when a position is detected or struck, rather than concentrating the entire system at a single control site. 5 radio nodes had been spread along the shoreline over a distance of roughly 4 miles, each one constantly checking the status of neighboring nodes several times per second. The moment the first station disappeared from the network, the routing path was refreshed almost instantly, and a backup node took over the relay in a fraction of a second, fast enough that the FPV screens showed almost no visible interruption. The video feed continued running. The control signals held steady. Telemetry data flowed exactly as before. Precise figures such as 50 milliseconds or 100 milliseconds are difficult to publicly verify in any specific real-world combat scenario. But what is well established is that distributed link networks like this are designed precisely to increase resilience against a strike on a single node. Ukraine has also used balloons, sensor nodes, and relay systems to expand detection, control, and the operational reach of drones across the battlefield. Above the water, the 6 FPV drones continued racing forward as if nothing had happened behind them. They had already traveled more than 1.5 miles from the launch point, skimming past their first reference marker, the collapsed wooden bridge near the water's edge, before continuing low along the shoreline, heading straight toward the spot where the 4 Russian boats were about to enter the narrow choke point. The strike from the salutes had been enough to tear apart a control position, but not enough to stop the hunt unfolding ahead. The FPV drones skimmed across a shallow basin of water that spread wide like a bowl, its surface so still that it reflected the gray sky above. On the control screens, the battery indicators remained in the mid-80% range, more than enough to reach the ambush zone and still leave some margin for a sharp correction maneuver in the final approach. The new problem was no longer battery life, it was distance. When the operators were forced to pull deeper into the trench system after the recent strike, they began falling behind the very FPV drones they had launched. Every extra yard of retreat pulled the controllers farther away from the drone swarm, and in an electronic warfare environment like Ukraine's battlefield, that could kill a strike with nothing more than a few signal bars dropping away. Open sources indicate that FPV drones in Ukraine often operate within a range of several miles when flown directly, though that range can be extended significantly through airborne relays or distributed relay networks. The backup team no longer had any comfortable options. They grabbed spare batteries, a spectrum analyzer, and a fresh antenna, then started moving toward the water's edge through a series of shallow, twisting trenches cut across the muddy delta ground. Heading that way meant moving closer to an area the Russians had likely already marked, waiting for reinforcement crews to reveal themselves. In this war, a drone control position that becomes exposed rarely has much time to remain stationary. Dense ISR coverage and rapid-fire mission coordination have made it possible for newly detected targets to be struck within minutes, sometimes even faster if attack assets are already nearby. Ahead of them, the 6 FPV drones kept racing forward as if nothing had happened behind them. They had already passed their second reference point, a cluster of ruined fishing shacks along the shoreline, marking the entrance to a maze of channels opening southward, and the video feed remained clear, telemetry steady. The hunt had not been broken, it had simply become more fragile, faster, and more dangerous for the people trying to keep it alive for just a few more minutes. The growing reliance by both sides on relay networks, distributed sensors, and mobile control methods is a direct consequence of a battlefield where drones have become the primary tools of destruction, forcing every operator team to fight while constantly on the move. Yesterday, the Russian boats had been moving along the northern route. Today, the FPV cameras saw nothing there. They had shifted nearly 3 miles south, forcing the Ukrainian drone group to sweep deeper into the delta. That small change immediately created a chain of new problems. The drones had to widen their search area, and the control teams had to keep pushing forward to prevent the signal from dropping out. The support team threaded their way again through muddy trenches and shallow earthworks, moving while constantly watching the spectrum analyzer. The Russian side remained silent, but that silence did not mean safety. After a strike by a loitering drone, moving toward the water's edge was the most predictable maneuver and often the place where the enemy waited for the next strike. About half a mile from the shoreline, the second team crawled up to a small firing berm, barely 3 feet high. It gave them a clean line of sight to rebuild the link, but almost nothing for cover. They pressed themselves down behind the dirt edge, reconnected the antenna, and restored the FPV video feed just in time. Ahead of them, the 6 FPV drones had already slipped into the outer channels of the delta. Battery indicators were now hovering around 60%. On the screens, the waterways began aligning with the preloaded map overlay. The open marsh behind them gradually gave way to tighter passages, places where the Russian boats would be forced to slow down. And that was where the ambush finally began to take shape. The planned interception point was now only about half a mile ahead. But just as the Ukrainian team finished stabilizing their position, short flashes suddenly erupted across the water on the opposite side. The Russians had spotted them first. It was not a lone sniper, but fire coming from either a shoreline observation post or a small patrol boat positioned directly along the approach. The first burst swept low, ripping across the surface of the water and slashing past the edge of the dirt mound where the Ukrainian team had just raised their antenna again. The second burst came closer, close enough for both men to feel the pressure of the air passing by their faces. Across the few hundred yards of open water, the Russians held nearly every advantage. A clear line of sight, bright reflections off the water's surface, and almost no terrain high enough to conceal a control team that had been forced to expose itself to maintain signal. The Ukrainian observer lifted his head for only a brief moment, just enough to catch the direction of the incoming fire. The rangefinder returned the distance almost instantly, while the digital map on his wrist immediately pinned the firing position to a narrow grid square along the shoreline. But here there was no time for the kind of extended artillery process typical in a land battle. Their mission was not to start a firefight. Their job was to keep the FPV swarm alive long enough to reach the bottleneck ahead. The second operator pressed the encrypted radio, sending a short, cold transmission. Position exposed. Fire from the opposite bank. Maintain low flight. Keep the link stable. Push the drones into the narrow channel. Ahead of them, the 6 FPV drones continued racing forward, batteries at roughly 65%, video feed still clean. The open marshland behind them was giving way to tighter waterways around the sandbar area where Russian boats would be forced to slow down, and it was there that the ambush was beginning to take shape. In the rear, the fire control team immediately fed the coordinates they had just received into the digital system. The rest was a problem for modern artillery, air temperature, humidity, propellant charge type, barrel condition, everything was entered to generate the firing solution. In American-style artillery, firing angles are usually calculated in mils rather than degrees. A full circle contains 6,400 mils, and at a distance of 1,000 meters, a deviation of 1 mil shifts the impact by roughly 1 meter on the ground. It is that cold mathematics that allows them to correct fire quickly under real combat conditions. But the man who still had to do the most dangerous part of the job was the observer at the water's edge. He had to expose himself once more to watch the first impact point. The opening round from the 155mm gun left the barrel at thousands of feet per second. With the standard American M795 shell, the projectile weighs about 103 pounds and carries nearly 24 pounds of high explosive, enough to turn an exposed firing position into a spray of dirt and splintered wood if it lands close enough. At this kind of range, the first round does not have to strike directly. It only needs to land close enough for the observer to read the error and adjust the next shot. Through the optic, he saw the first column of dirt erupt slightly off the shoreline where the Russian muzzle flash had just appeared. Not enough. He pressed the transmitter and delivered a short correction in the language artillery understands fastest, write add. At the other end, the gun crew only needed to shift the barrel a tiny fraction of the circle and elevate slightly to pull the impact point onto the center of the target. The next rounds came almost immediately. The first fell short. The second arced across the edge of the bank. The third slammed directly into the firing position, throwing up a column of dirt, wood, and debris. The opposite shoreline went silent, and the moment the gunfire died away, the 6 FPV drones ahead continued racing into the narrowing channel of the Kerch Strait, where the ambush was tightening with every passing second. No more gunshots echoed across the water. The Ukrainian team treated that silence as an opportunity, not safety. They signaled the third unit, positioned more than a mile to the north. 3 reserve FPV drones were powered up, signal locked, and then dropped southward toward the same waterways where the first wave had already disappeared into the maze of sandbars and narrow channels. The third team was still intact. Their task was to provide another layer of backup if the first wave was intercepted or lost signal at the final moment. At the shoreline, the Ukrainian operators raised their antenna again, glanced quickly across their monitors, and fixed their eyes on the video feeds. The original 6 FPV drones had now pushed deep into the southern channels, their batteries dropping below 60%. The water on the screen appeared darker between telemetry updates, while the terrain began to tighten into narrow corridors where Russian boats would have very few navigation options. Then the water ahead revealed what they had been searching for. A flash of sunlight glinted across the waves. Another wake cut across the current. Then a growing block of heat appeared on the display. 4 shapes. 4 engines. 4 Russian boats pushing at full speed to force their way through the choke point. The Ukrainian controllers steadied their hands and began updating the final intercept coordinates. But at that moment, they were no longer the only hunters. The first Russian FPV appeared high on the right side of the screen. The second skimmed low from the left. The third came straight in from the front. The Russians had begun intercepting with their own FPV drones, a tactic that has become increasingly common as both sides now use drones to hunt drones rather than relying only on traditional air defense fire. Reuters has reported that both Ukraine and Russia deploy interceptor drones to chase down and destroy each other's reconnaissance and attack drones. The Ukrainian team's spectrum analyzer began showing spikes across the 5.8 GHz band, a frequency range commonly used by analog FPV systems on the battlefield. They did not need to decode the video feed to know what was approaching. The growing peaks in signal strength alone revealed incoming drones. For FPVs that do not use fiber optic control lines, the video and control signals themselves are the most visible weakness, radiating outward rather than forming a narrow beam like a laser. For that reason, Ukrainian drone teams long ago learned to use inexpensive spectrum scanners to detect enemy control signals before they even saw the drone itself on camera or with the naked eye. Reuters has described today's drone battlefield as a dense kill zone, where interceptor drones and low-cost detection tools are increasingly used to break incoming strikes. The leading Russian FPV dove from above, aiming for the blind angle above the Ukrainian drone's camera. The pilot saw only a shadow rapidly growing across the screen before jerking the controls sharply to the right. The first Russian drone missed by only a few feet, but it was almost certainly a trap. The second had already positioned itself along the likely escape path the opposing pilot would choose. The Ukrainian operator cut the throttle and dropped his drone toward the water like a falling stone. The second interceptor overshot. The third immediately climbed to block the low escape route. At that point, everything became a brutal equation of speed and delay. With both sides moving at roughly 60 miles per hour and with human reaction time and video latency involved, the target seen on the screen was already somewhere else. By the time a control command reached the drone, both aircraft had already slipped several more yards through the air. Reuters has recently reported that Ukraine is accelerating the development of AI-assisted interceptor drones precisely because human pilots are increasingly struggling to keep pace with these ultra-close aerial engagements. The Ukrainian pilot pulled hard on the controls, pushing the motors to full power and hauling the FPV sharply upward from the water, nearly colliding with the third interceptor that had begun climbing to block him. Now, all 3 Russian FPVs were below him, forced to climb against gravity while he could dive at any moment. He banked toward the bright reflection of sunlight on the sea, knowing that if the enemy cameras were blinded for even a moment, it might buy him a few extra seconds of survival. But on the screen, more black dots were lifting from concealed positions along the shoreline. 4, 5, 6. They did not need to be better. They only needed to be more numerous. And inside the narrow, twisting waterways of the Kerch Strait, once both sides had spotted each other, the hunt was no longer about who detected the other first. It was about which side ran out of drones first. Reuters, citing Ukrainian sources, has reported that drones now account for the majority of strikes on the battlefield, and that environment has pushed both sides toward interception tactics built increasingly on sheer numbers. The Russian drone ramming attacks were serving another purpose as well. Even when they failed to make contact, forcing the Ukrainian pilots to keep braking hard, dropping their noses, and climbing again was draining battery power second by second and tearing apart their concentration at the exact moment they needed it most. Every evasive move meant a few more percent of battery gone. Every second spent staying alive was a second not spent locking onto the boats. And that pressure was no small thing. 6 enemy drones were hunting you. The ground control position might already be exposed, and behind you was the threat of mortars or a follow-on strike. Reuters has noted that the battlefield in Ukraine has now become a drone-saturated kill zone where both sides are constantly trying to detect launch points, sever control links, and break up an attack before it reaches its target. Many pilots in that situation would abort the mission when the battery still had around 50% left. Others would keep flying until the voltage collapsed completely and the FPV dropped straight into the mud, but that did not happen today. In a quick sideways glance while evading, the Ukrainian operator finally saw what he had been hunting from the start. Below, in the narrow channels, not 3 but 4 Russian boats were moving in single file through a waterway only a few dozen feet wide, completely unaware that a drone dogfight had just taken place above their heads. The battery indicator on the screen had already turned amber at around 35%. He made the decision instantly. Mark the position, pass the formation's direction of movement to the second strike wave, then keep the FPV alive for as long as possible. As he transmitted the coordinates, he shoved the drone's nose straight toward the nearest Russian interceptor in a low-altitude bluff. The Russian pilot broke hard to the right, choosing to preserve his own drone rather than commit to another intercept pass. The Ukrainian FPV kept its eyes on the boat formation until the battery dropped to around 20%, then died somewhere in the marshes, in a place where it could not be recovered. That kind of trade-off fits the reality of the modern battlefield, where FPVs are cheap, disposable systems thrown at targets, according to a logic of attrition more than asset preservation. Reuters reported that Ukraine had pushed plans to procure around 4.5 million FPVs in 2025. And according to the commander of Ukraine's unmanned forces, these weapons now account for more than 60% of targets destroyed on the battlefield. The Russian boat team, now alerted that Ukrainian drones were overhead, immediately split course to make the interception problem harder. But that only bought them a few extra seconds. 3 Ukrainian FPVs from the 3rd unit came diving in from the north, merging into the sky with the 3 survivors of the first wave before splitting their attack angles. The lead boat was hit right at the waterline, exactly where the inflatable tube joined the rigid hull, the weakest point of that kind of craft, when struck by a small warhead placed in the right spot. The second boat tried to cut sharply into the reeds, but in a channel only a few dozen feet wide, a high-speed turn only left the stern exposed longer. The pursuing FPV stayed with it and drove straight into the engine area, turning it into a powerless, drifting wreck. The third tried to run up onto a shallow bank and hide in the reeds, but thermal cameras do not care whether the human eye can still see the target or not. Heat from the engine, heat from the bodies, all of it stood out against the cool shoreline background. The fourth made it a little farther, then was also caught while trying to slip behind a low sandbar. In this kind of warfare, FPVs do not need to carry large warheads like a 155mm shell to create decisive effects. It is their ability to hit the weak points of small vehicles that makes them such an effective asymmetric tool, while modern Ukrainian interceptor drones are described by Reuters as costing only around $1,000 each, far cheaper than traditional interceptor munitions. The final result was simple, but far from small. 4 boats were taken out of the fight. The supplies they were carrying would not reach the shoreline observation posts on that morning run. And the real meaning of this strike was not simply that Ukraine destroyed several fast boats, but that it proved that with nothing more than a group of cheap FPVs, a field relay network, a few mobile control teams, and the ability to adapt faster than the enemy, they could cut a logistical link right in the middle of an area Russia believed it controlled tightly enough. In this war, destroying a small resupply run does not only mean lost cargo or lost men. It forces the other side to change routes, change timing, assign more escort drones, spread its forces thinner, and spend far more resources on a mission it once considered routine. That is the real cost of the ambush, not just 4 boats, but forcing Russia to operate more slowly, more cautiously, and more expensively across every mile of water at Kerch. Reuters has also shown that drones have fundamentally changed the way war is fought in Ukraine, to the point that infantry formations, tanks, and even frontline transport now all have to adapt around the threat posed by these small, cheap, and highly unpredictable systems. Tomorrow, the Russians may try a different route, a different time window, or send interceptor drones up earlier. But tomorrow, the Ukrainian crews will return as well with fresh batteries, new antennas, and the same old equation: who sees whom first, who keeps the link longer, and who runs out of drones first. How do you assess the real significance of this Ukrainian ambush? Was it just a small strike against logistics, or is it a sign that FPVs are turning every supply route into a target that can be hunted at any moment? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more analysis.